Our next speaker, Ed Dover's background more than qualifies him to speak on a tale of aeronautical adventure. With a youthful fascination with radio communications, he graduated in that subject and joined American Airways as a flight radio officer in 1942. He made many flights aboard Pan Am's flying boats, including several on the Pacific Clipper, which is the heroic aircraft in his book. With the elimination of radio officers after the Second World War, he joined the Civil Aeronautics Authority and was assigned to communication duties on remote Pacific islands, later becoming an air traffic controller in the U.S. after retirement in 1981. He received his interest in accounts of Captain Ford's remarkable flight. Then a chance meeting with old classmates at the 1991 reunion of his high school resulted in interviews with Captain Ford and flight radio officer Eugene Leach. These interviews, along with Ed's personal experiences and considerable research, provided the foundation for this long overdue, authentic account of a significant event in aviation history. Please welcome here now to present The Long Way Home, Ed Dover.
Okay, before we really get into my story, I'd like to introduce, if they're in the audience, two people who, unlike me, actually were on board Captain Ford's famous B-314 at the time of its diversion after Pearl Harbor, and what turned out to be a very historic flight. First of all, there's a gentleman by the name of Ralph Hitchcock, better known as Mo. I met him yesterday, and I don't know if he's here. Mo, are you here today in the audience? If you will, Thank you. If it wasn't for Mo and his fellow mechanics, Bud Washer, and the chief mechanic from Austin, Vern White, this flight may have died a borning when the engine failed at Trincomalee. They repaired it. Okay? Yes?
Bud Washer's son is here.
Pardon?
Bud Washer's son is here.
Great. Bud Washer's son is here. Thank you. Thank you. There is, yes? He was also on the flight, as a little child, no doubt. Okay, speaking of little children, one other person who I have not met, unfortunately, yet, and I don't know if she's here, Mary Hurd Barton, are you here? Mary Hurd Barton? I guess not. Mary Hurd Barton was the 5-year-old daughter of Folger Ethern, who was the airport manager at Noumea at the time they evacuated all the Pan Am personnel from there, eventually bringing them back to the United States. Without getting into too much detail, because I'm going to get into it later, she wrote me a letter shortly after the book was published and told me of a rather interesting little incident. As a 5-year-old, she remembers on the day they evacuated Noumea, apparently the flying boat was not at the dock. It was out in the bay at Noumea on a buoy, and they had to take the people out to the flying boat in a launch. And she remembers that it was a windy day, and as they drove out to the flying boat, this little 5-year-old girl's hat blew into the water. And she relates, without identifying the person, that some kind gentleman fished it out for her before they got on the airplane. So she, Bud Washer, and Mo Hitchcock are living representatives. And as far as I know, the only living representatives of persons who are actually on board the flight I'm going to talk about. Okay? Now, one more favor. Since our time constraints may be a little tight, I'd like to have you hold your questions till the flight is over so that we can do them all at once, and I would not like to interrupt my narrative, if that's okay with you. Okay. One quick explanation, and then we'll into the flight. Why did I write this book? Captain Ford's flight is well known, has been well known for many years by many in Pan Am and outside of Pan Am. But why would I want to write another story about it? Let me tell you why. When I first became interested in this story, I began doing some research. And amongst my research were several fine books, all of which mentioned his flight. But the mention was rather sparse. To give you an example, I have 4 examples. M.D. Klaus, in his fine coffee table book, Last of the Flying Clippers, the Boeing B-314 story, a great book of 320 pages, devotes 3 pages to Captain Ford's flight. Stan Cohen's fine book, Wings to the Orient, 214 pages, 1 page about Captain Ford's book. Barnaby Conrad's Pan Am, an Aviation Legend, a 208-page coffee table book, 1 page devoted to Ford's flight. And finally, Robert Daly, in his tremendous biography about one trip and Pan Am, an American saga, out of 529-page book, 6 pages devoted to Ford's flight. I said to myself, there's more to this story than meets the eye in these reports. I had flown on the Clipper, not on that flight, but later on. I had known the sensation of what it was like to be aboard that plane, similar to what you experienced vicariously through Stefan's simulation. But I experienced the real thing. The vibration, the noise, the sound of the takeoff, the slap of the water on the hull, all of that was kind of missing from their essentially factual reports of the flight. And in line with another philosophy that I have, which could be well expressed in the previous roundtable about how to write and publish your work, I followed the dictates of a very important slogan. If you want to be a successful writer, write about what you know. I know about the B-314 and my experience with it. So I decided to write this book. To cut that little story short so we get right on to flight, Palliter Press, courtesy of Ron Davies, was good enough to see the value of my version and published the book in 1999. And it's been going fairly well since then. So, without, as I say, further ado, let's get into the spirit of our flight into history. NC 18602, the Pacific Clipper. This fine photograph by Clyde Sutherland was probably taken about the same time you've seen some of the other photographs of 02 over San Francisco Bay. I use this to illustrate this is the ship that made the flight, okay? And now I want you to imagine that you are passengers standing on the dock at Treasure Island. It is no longer November 5th, 2005. It's December 1st, 1941. You are either passengers or crew members about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. You walk down the gangway, across the sea wing, and into luxury. Here, I know you've seen pictures of the interior of the Boeings, and these may be somewhat repetitious, but to emphasize the point about what the B-314 was all about, it was, for its era, the most luxurious commercial aircraft in existence. And as you enter the lounges and the seating areas, you can see that. An interesting statistic comes up. Jumping back for a moment to 2005, most of you probably got here via airliner, flying in relatively comfortable jets. Comfortable, question mark. Due to the economics of 2005, they have to jam as many people as they can into those airplanes to make a buck. So, taking into account a dimension which you may have heard before, the pitch on the seats of today's average jet from the back of one seat to the back of the other is 36 inches. The width of the seats, what? 20, 25, maybe 30 inches. Let's be a little generous and say the average square footage for a passenger on today's jets is allotted 9 square feet of space in which to move around, or not move around as you see fit. On the B314, it was designed to accommodate an average floor space for each passenger of 22 square feet. Okay? Here, one of the simpler seating arrangements, 3 on this side, 2 on the other, the passageway in between. And often, the luxury of the interior was such that you might as well be sitting in your own living room. And of course, the styles of the day are interesting. And of course, what we've probably all seen since then, the dining facilities. Lap tray, what's a lap tray? Tables, fine linen, fine china, sterling silver, white-coated stewards, 7-course Class A gourmet meals. And this was first class, the only class offered by Pan American on the Clippers, truly a flying palace. And since these flights were overnight from San Francisco to Honolulu, they provided sleeping accommodations and toilets and boudoirs and dressing rooms and dressing tables that you might find in the finest hotel as the passengers got ready for a good night's sleep as they droned over the ocean. And while they slept, the ever-vigilant flight crews took their positions on this flight deck, which even today is considered one of the largest, most commodious flight decks ever built into an airliner. I think it was 20 feet long, 9 feet wide, a little over 6 feet high, and that little hatch just beyond the radio desk. Oh, no, oops, sorry, went backwards. There. That's the radio desk. There's the hatch, and there's a spiral staircase going downstairs to the passenger deck. The first commercial airliner to incorporate a double deck into its design. Let me qualify that. The first commercial airliner in practical use to have a double deck. And out of this double deck design, the descendant of that design was the double deck 747. Okay? And here, the navigator's table. Why is that table so big? Because they navigated by rather what we would call primitive methods. Celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and possibly, when they could get it, radio navigation. He would spread out his Mercator chart on that table and laboriously plot his position hour by hour as they droned across the spaces of the Pacific Ocean. Here in this corner, we can see just the edge of the engineer's table. Now you've all saw Stefan's simulation, so you know pretty much of the instrumentation of the engineer and the instrumentation of the pilots. But here was the radio desk. That was my office. The Morse code keys, the headphones, the radios, and the intercom connections. And over here, an interesting gadget. This little thing is sort of like a periscope. And when they could see the ocean whitecaps below them, one of the best ways to determine the drift of the wind was to push that periscope out through the side of the aircraft, gaze to the telescopic sight, and line up some crosshairs on the whitecaps until the whitecaps were flowing parallel to the crosshairs. And whatever angle the crosshairs took, that was your wind correction angle as the airplane drifted. Okay? Here, the navigator takes his navigational sight on stars. The most basic way to do this was with a 3-star fix, which took approximately 20 minutes to line up each star, get the sighting, and as you've heard before, that when they took these star sights, the pilots had to take the aircraft off autopilot because the autopilot tended to hunt a little bit, to hold a steady course so they could get a correct sighting. They flew it manually for the 20 or 30 minutes he needed to get his sightings. He'd plot his 3 stars, go to his star tables, go back to the desk, plot the lines, and maybe 30 minutes later, he could put a dot in the middle of that triangle and say, "Oh, this is about where we ought to be." And that was navigation at its best in those days. And of course, you've heard about the wings. Yesterday, I gave you a rather colorful illustration of how that was used in one respect for the wing wars. But on a practical note, the engineers could get out to those wings in flight. And I want you to notice, here's the catwalk. From here in the flight deck to the first engine nacelle, this is looking into the number 3 engine. You could sort of crouch down and get through. But by the time you got to the other side of the number 3 engine, going into the distant catwalk into the number 4 engine, you were pretty much down on your hands and knees. But within the confines of the nacelle itself, between the catwalks, there was enough room to sit down. And one remark that Ron Davies has made, which I sort of thought was amusing, he said that behind each engine, there was a little bench. You could sit there. There was enough room behind each engine so that the 4 husky people holding that wing gown could have a little poker game in there while waiting to get out. Okay? One other thing to notice, and I'm going to refer to this later. See these wires? Those are the control cables leading out to the ailerons, the trim tabs, and other flight controls that controlled the motion of the aircraft. Okay? The reason I point that out will become clear as we proceed in the flight. Now the pilot's compartment. Captain, co-pilot. As you can see from the title, this was a Boeing company picture taken on January 13th, 1939, probably around the time of delivery of the first Boeings to Pan Am. Those of you who are experienced pilots may look at this panel, especially the flight instruments in front of each pilot, just beyond the control yokes. Aside from the multi-engine dials up here, some of the other engine instruments, such as the vacuum, clock, outside air temperature, and so forth, the in-flight instruments, guess what? When I first took my initial training as a private pilot in a Cessna 150, I had more instrumentation than this in a Cessna 150. As big as they were, the state of the art of navigation was reasonably primitive compared to what we have today. And here, the old automatic pilot. Okay? Notice, for another example. Where are the throttles on this aircraft? Some of you who flew on the 314 will know that answer. Some of you who have not may not. Notice here, this looks like a passageway, and this is a hatch. This hatch leads to the bow compartment, where one of the junior officers would have to go in order to stick his head out the bow hatch and get the mooring lines from the boats upon docking when landing. There was no room here for throttles. They would block the access to the hatch. Okay, it doesn't show in this picture, but off on the left-hand bulkhead beside the pilot and the right-hand bulkhead for the co-pilot were these set of throttles. You probably saw them in Stephen's simulation, those throttle handles. So the pilot controlled the throttles with his left hand while holding the yoke with his right, and vice versa for the co-pilot. And I don't know about those rudder pedals. Pan Am pilots must have had the biggest feet in the world. I've never seen such large rudder pedals in my life. Okay, that's this brief tour of the accommodations and facilities that are yours, at your disposal, as we get ready to board the Clipper from Treasure Island. Here we see NC 18602 pulled out of the water on its docking cradle, and this is an excellent shot demonstrating the size of this thing. 42 tons, 152-foot wingspan, think about it, a little more than half the length of a football field, 106 feet long. A wondrous aircraft of its day. Now, this is a picture which I'm going to explain very briefly to answer a question that has come up often in discussing Ford's flight. The question is, was there more than one aircraft involved in his adventure? Some said yes, some said no. When I wrote my book, my research had not reached a point where I had a definitive answer to this. So I said in my book, I'm going to treat this as though it was one aircraft. But if evidence comes up later to say otherwise, I will acknowledge that and make all the effort I can to correct the record. Well, the evidence came up. This is a handwritten log written by Fourth Officer John Steers. And if you look here, it says 18606, the California Clipper. From San Francisco to San Pedro to Honolulu, a total flying time of 22 hours and 58 minutes. According to this, then from Honolulu on, ditto marks indicate it was all the way with 1602. Was that proof enough? Is it possible that John Steers, as a neophyte member of the crew, he had just transferred from Atlantic Division, perhaps was not familiar with the numbers on the Pacific Division aircraft? Could he have possibly made a mistake? We needed some additional proof. So, later on, I got lucky. A gentleman in Tacoma, Washington, by the name of Derek Huey, was the conservator for the estate of First Officer John Mack. When he found out about my book, he sent me some very interesting information, including this actual excerpt from John Mack's official pilot flight log. Notice what Mack logs. NC 18602, San Francisco to Honolulu, direct, and 02 all the way. If we believe John Mack, it was 02 all the way. Now we have two conflicting reports. Which one is right? There was one more piece of evidence which came to light a little later on. And I was fortunate enough to receive a letter from James White, Jr., the son of senior pilot, First Officer James White, Sr. James White, Sr. had written a letter to Captain Duke Campbell of the Clipper Pioneers in 1996, explaining in detail his role in Captain Ford's flight. And I refer you to the second paragraph, which for your edification, I have magnified. Looking back now to early December 1941, I was walking around Treasure Island picking up a few loose ends of ground school when security stopped me and advised me to call Miss Lee and scheduling immediately. Miss Lee said that Johnny Mack had called in and said he couldn't make his scheduled trip to New Zealand, and notice the odd spelling of New Zealand, that evening with Bob Ford. That I was to go home immediately, put on my uniform, and report for the trip as first officer in his place. Johnny would arrive the next day on the Honolulu shuttle. I would be offloaded in Honolulu and return to San Francisco in his place. Well and good. I missed the round-the-world excursion, but Bob Ford and his crew getting back to San Francisco made it. Such are the workings of fate. Now we have three pieces of evidence, and we know that from San Francisco to San Pedro to Honolulu, Ford and Jim White Sr. and the other members of the crew had 18606, what was then called the American Clipper. Okay? NC 18602, which we know now as the Pacific Clipper, came into play for most of the crew from Honolulu forward. And here is that crew. A real Renaissance man, Captain Robert Ford, a master of ocean flying boats, 35 years old at the time of this flight. And what a great guy he was. John Henry Mack, the first officer, Roderick Norman Brown, the second officer. James G. Henriksen, third officer. John Delmer Steers, the fourth officer. Homans K. Swede Rothy, the first engineering officer. John Bertrand Parrish, second engineering officer. Jack D. Poindexter, first radio officer. One quick aside, when I came to work for Pan Am in '42, Jack was my supervisor, so I knew him well. Okay. Oscar Hendrickson, the second radio officer. And think about, just back a minute, we looked at Henriksen was the, third officer? Hendrickson was the radio officer. Guess what happens when it's hard to hear who you want to talk to? Henriksen? Which guy do you want? That was a little point of confusion sometimes. Barney Sawicki, the flight steward. Vern C. Edwards, assistant flight steward. I never learned much about the personal life of Barney Sawicki, but I did learn that Vern C. Edwards, even though he was an assistant flight steward, he and his wife were both accomplished concert pianists. A little bit of trivia there. Okay? With this illustrious crew and Eugene Leach, the third radio officer, who didn't come on board actually until they had reached Noumea. This was the crew that now is going to take us on this adventure. Here, this is not O2, but I don't have a picture of O2 taking off. So this is a substitute. Just to give you the idea, 42 tons of wonderful airplane breaking the water and reaching for the heavens. What more dramatic sight can there be? Okay? And finally getting off and underway. Thanks to the good offices of Ron Davies and his expertise with cartography, there's his initials in the, oops, sorry. There's his initials in the lower left-hand corner. He provided the maps for my book and differentiated the view of what was supposedly the normal flight as opposed to what, as you can see in preview, what they really had to do. So they start out from San Francisco to San Pedro to Honolulu. In all innocence, on December 1st, they get to San Pedro, and the next day, the evening of December 2nd, they leave for Honolulu, and they arrive in Honolulu December 3rd. At that same time, John Mack leaves Honolulu and leaves San Francisco and arrives in Honolulu, and they meet and make that switch. Now, in Honolulu, they have a day of rest. So they go to the beach at Waikiki, they play volleyball, they even engage in little poker games. Meanwhile, up here, somewhere in the North Pacific, the Japanese Imperial Fleet is slowly wending its way toward Hawaii, unbeknownst to everyone involved. So, the following day, they take up the route. Oh, before we get into that, they are at Honolulu. And here is one of my favorite pictures. NC 18602. How do I know what's 02? We can't see this the number, but we do see number 18. That was Boeing's designation. What it really meant, I don't know. It may have been a production run number or whatever. But NC02 had number 18 on its bow. Here it is, parked at the dock in Pearl City in Pearl Harbor. And jumping momentarily back to the 21st century, in 2004, Nancy, my wife, and I, through the good offices of a retired Marine colonel, were taken through the Navy security gate at the Navy housing area at Pearl City down to the dock where we were able and honored to stand on the very ground where that clipper had been moored. This monument is located precisely where the clippers docked. I know it's precise because in researching this location, there are other pictures, particularly of the Martin M130 at this dock. And in looking at those pictures, you can see these mountains behind the picture. And this is the only spot in Pearl City where you can look from the shore across where the Boeing was anchored and see this ridge. If you moved away from this spot, the ridge was out of your line of sight. So by a simple triangulation, we know this area up behind us was where the Clippers actually docked. And this monument was placed there, dedicated November 22nd, 1985, to employees of Pan American Airways, or by employees of Pan American Airways, during ceremonies honoring the 50th year of operation of flying boats by Pan American. And that if you manage to get into the naval housing area, go down to the shore, and you can see this monument. Okay. Once again, we're off from Honolulu, and we're down, back to the map, and we're coming from Honolulu to Canton, to Suva, to Noumea. Canton, 2 degrees below the equator and blazing hot. Okay? Suva in the Fijis, a little further down, somewhat more comfortable. Noumea, New Caledonia, French New Caledonia then. And there we stop overnight. Now, in going along this route, actually we stopped overnight at each of these places. And going over this route from Canton to Suva, we cross the 180th meridian, which is the international date line. We have now lost 1 day. And at Noumea, when it's December 8th, Monday, December 8th, 1941, guess what it is back here? And guess where these Japanese aircraft are? Right above here. Unbeknownst to that, Ford and his crew take off on what they think will be the last routine stop before returning home. They fly from Noumea, and they start out for Auckland. 2 hours out of Auckland, more likely roughly somewhere in this area. Eugene Leach, the radio operator, he came on board at Noumea because he was deadheading to Auckland to do some radio maintenance work down there. He was on duty at the radio desk, idly tuning a broadcast station for some news or music or whatever. And he comes across a signal loud and clear: the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. He is astounded. And in talking to Eugene, I asked him what his response was when he heard that. Because in my book, in my own imaginative way, I have him utter a rather unique, well, not unique, but a rather strong 4-letter expletive. Holy bleep. Okay? The navigator standing next to him at the night desk looks around and says, "What's up?" Eugene says, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Better tell the skipper." He tells the skipper, "Ford is not so panicky." He turns around and says, "Are you sure about that? Better check it out." They turn back to the radio desk. By this time, the Pan Am radio station in Noumea is calling in Morse code to 02 with an urgent message. Eugene Leach copies the message in Morse code on a sheet of paper, looks at it, and realizes that it says, "Pearl Harbor attacked, execute Plan A." How many of you know what Plan A was? Anybody? That's it. A couple of you. Backtracking just for a moment. In 1941, the United States knew that something was up. And Captain Ford, in his own words, told me in a personal interview that they knew that something was going to happen. And one trip, and the government had made arrangements that in event of hostilities, all of Pan Am's planes would be turned over to the military, either the Army or the Navy, for their total disposal. And this was articulated in a special document, top secret, called Plan A. Each captain leaving San Francisco on a flight into the South Pacific or across this way was issued a secret document in a legal-sized envelope marked "Top Secret for Captain's Eyes Only." These instructions told them what to do in the event when, and Captain Ford was extremely positive to tell me what to do when the Japanese attacked, not if. Okay? Ford opens his letter, reads the instructions, which he says were darn good. In effect, they didn't do anything really untoward. Only 2 hours out of Auckland, he continues into Auckland, but he causes everything to be immediately shut down to radio silence. No more radio transmissions, no more flying with lights on, everything blacked out. And as an extra precaution, Ford reaches into his flight bag and pulls out his .38 caliber revolver and straps it around his waist. What does he know? That maybe there's some kind of enemy agent on board ready to sabotage the flight? He doesn't. So they proceed into Auckland. Now, I don't know if they notified the passengers at that time. My inkling is to think that Ford was a very methodic person. And he thinks perhaps, and this is my imagination, if we tell the passengers now while we're in flight, there's going to be all kinds of panic. I don't want that in flight. Let's wait until we land, and then we'll tell them. So my version of the story is that what he did. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I'm using a little bit of logic that he would have used in this circumstance. So they get to Auckland. What happens to the passengers of that, I don't know. Each of them went their way. Those who were living in New Zealand probably got off and went home. Those who had plans for other flights had to make other arrangements. The flight crew went to the hotel and waited for orders because the Plan A document called for, if they made it to their latest destination okay, they were to await orders from New York headquarters as to what to do next. Well, in the meantime, other Pan Am aircraft had received their Plan A orders. Captain Hamilton in the M130 at Wake that got shot up. Another captain in a clipper heading for Honolulu turned around, landed at Hilo, and then went back to San Francisco. And other captains who had their Plan A orders. So they cooled their heels in Auckland, well, darn near 2 weeks, and no messages came through. All messages had to go through the American consular office and had to be coded in secret code before they could be delivered. So Ford, every day, haunted the consulate, wondering where his instructions were. Finally, they came through. And what kind of instructions they were. Your flight back to Honolulu has been canceled. Canton Island has been abandoned. You no longer have refueling facilities. We don't know where the Japanese are anywhere in this area. Your best bet, if you can do this, return to Namia, evacuate all Pan Am personnel, take them to Gladstone, Australia, and from there, take this aircraft and head west the best you can and get back to New York. Good luck. So, Ford and his men huddled together. A B-314, this aircraft the size of B-314, has never flown over this territory before. It is terra incognita. They have no maps. They don't know where they're going to get gas or servicing. They don't know even if the Japanese are operating in this area. But under complete radio blackout, secrecy, lights out at night, they start out. They return to Namia, and they evacuate all Pan Am personnel, take them to Gladstone, where Pan Am has arranged for the for the Pan Am people to be taken by train to Sydney, eventually placed on a surface ship, and sail back to the United States. Meanwhile, the crew, including now the mechanic Vern White from Auckland, the two mechanics, Ralph Hitchcock and Bud Washer from Namia, and I believe there was a meteorologist also on board whose identity I have not as yet determined. They and the crew start out from Gladstone, and the first stop they determine is their most logical place is Darwin. Look closely at this map. Gladstone to Darwin is all over land, the great Australian outback. No rivers to speak of, no lakes, no oceans. This is a flying boat with no wheels. If any engine had glitched enough to cause a forced landing, that would have been where it ended, and no further word. But 11 hours later, they make it to Darwin. And they find Darwin is a city in complete panic because the Japanese have already conducted air raids there. The people are rushing about, piling their belongings on any kind of truck or conveyance they could to flee the city and head inland. And even the Australian military is of no help. It seems that just before they arrived, the first freighter docked at Darwin with the first supply of beer they'd seen in 6 weeks, and the Australian Army went bonkers. Okay? So, with the help of a harbor master in the Darwin harbor, they managed to get some gas. Okay? By the way, when they landed at Gladstone, there was no aviation fuel available. Ford decided this flight from Mia to Gladstone was short enough that it had enough fuel to make it, and they did. But by the time they got to Darwin, they really needed to refuel. Fortunately, they found a supply of 100-octane aviation fuel, fueled up, and then started on their way to Surabaya, and what was then called the Dutch East Indies. Now, Surabaya was also within the war zone, and Ford wanted to make sure that they knew they were coming, even though they were blacked out. So he asked the ground people at Darwin to send a message ahead through the diplomatic channels, and hopefully it would get to Surabaya before they did, and Surabaya would know they were coming. As usual, government bureaucrats, something happened, the message never got through. So they're innocently flying along the chain of the Indonesian islands, and they're coming up on Surabaya when all at once they're flying along, enjoying the scenery of Bali and what seems to be a peaceful space, and all of a sudden, zip, a blip goes by the aircraft. He looks at it. That's a Dutch fighter. The Dutch fighter has spotted the Clipper. Remember, this airplane has never flown in this part of the world before. No one has ever seen it. No one knows anything about it. The Dutch fighter pilot looks at this and says, uh-oh. He turns around and gets on its tail. And he radios in to the airbase at Surabaya. We got a bogey up here, westbound at 8. What'll I do? Surabaya comes back on the radio and says, follow up, we're sending help. 3 other fighters are launched. Eventually, here's this whale of a Boeing, carefully flying in towards Surabaya. 3 Dutch fighters with their guns aimed right at his tail, and Ford can't communicate with them. The Dutch fighters are on a channel that the Boeing cannot transmit on, but they can hear them. Jack Poindexter is monitoring it, and the Dutch fighters are talking among themselves. One says, what shall we do? Another one says, that's a pretty big target. I think we ought to shoot it down now. Another one says, hold on, we need ground approval. So the ground commander says, can you identify this? One Dutch airplane comes in over the top, looks down on the wing of the Boeing, and there, by the grace of God, is a remnant of an American flag still remaining on the top of the Boeing, because when they were at Auckland, they had been ordered to remove all markings from the ship. But they were in such a hurry to get away from there, Ford abandoned that project in favor of loading on the spare parts and engines they needed and going back and getting the Pan Am personnel. So here was the Boeing, a remnant of an American flag planted on top. The Dutch fighter reports this to his commander on the ground, and the commander says, anybody can paint flags on airplanes. Stay on his tail. If he so much as waggles a wing the wrong way, take him down. Ford, previously at Darwin, had received from the harbor master there a set of secret codes and turn maneuvers that he might be able to use at Surabaya to identify himself as friendly. Well, they couldn't use the secret codes because they couldn't communicate. But he decided to follow the maneuvers that he was given. And gently, over a certain point in the approach, he makes a turn. The fighters are right on his tail. He turns the other way. The fighters are on his tail. And the fighter pilot reports, he's made an appropriate turn over point X-ray. And the commander says, that's fine, keep on his tail. Finally, they reach the harbor at Surabaya, a very small harbor, full of ships, no real place for a Boeing B-314 to land. But just outside the harbor is a breakwater. Ford decides to land outside the harbor, parallel to the breakwater, and then taxi in. And as he does so, and he touches down, and the fighters come zooming across and go on their way. And they say he's landed. The commander turns the jurisdiction of that intercept over to the ground people. A harbor pilot boat comes out to meet them, and Ford very gingerly begins to follow it in to the harbor. To make a little story short on this incident, he gets tied up. They go on shore. The commander comes down to meet them and says, "You were very lucky fellows. You landed in the middle of a minefield." Heaven's sakes. In addition to that, you came on a day when our radio was working. Normally it's not, because we've had supply problems with the radio equipment. If the radio had not been working, our fighter pilots had standing orders to shoot down anything strange just to be on the safe side. We could have shot you down, but our radio was working, and Ford says, well, that's great. You know. So, they land safely at Surabaya. You think that solves the problem? They have used up almost all of their gas getting from Darwin to Surabaya. Surabaya has no aviation fuel. The commander offers autogas. I think, 76 octane. They needed 100. Ford had to make a decision. He needed gas. There was no way they were going to make it on the next leg to Trincomalee and Ceylon on what they had in the tanks. So he confers with Sweet Rothy, the engineer. He says, well, it's never been done before, but we have enough 100 octane to use just for landing and takeoff. Let's fill the rest of the tanks with autogas and use it for en route cruise where it's a little safer. We have a little more leeway in altitude. Maybe we can get away with it. So they load the airplane with autogas, take off from Surabaya, fly along the coast of Sumatra, and by this time it's nightfall, and they're flying up to Trincomalee. Now, during this time, in this area here across the Indian Ocean, they run into a very terrific storm. And for those of you who are IFR rated, you may be able to identify with what I'm going to do next. Not with too egotistical a stretch on it, but in my book, on page 96, I describe what it was like for them to fly through this storm on instruments. And give me the liberty to read one small chapter, that's all I'm going to read out of this book, one small paragraph, describing what I think was the situation with regard to that moment in their flight. Soon it began to rain, intermittently at first and continuously as the hours dragged by. Crew members observed their duty rotation schedules with barely a word of conversation. The mechanics and off-duty crew members on the lower deck slept fitfully among the clutter and close confines created by all the spare parts. The night became an endurance contest between the crew and the machine. The pilots were now flying totally on instruments as the lowering rain clouds obscured any physical view of the ocean or sky. It was as though they were all in a sort of endless black limbo, jostled by the intermittent turbulence, listening to the staccato sound of rain against the fuselage and the constant drone of the engines. The world outside had ceased to exist. They were alone in the universe, and there was no end in sight to their journey. That, my friends, is my impression of what it might have been like flying through the night over that Indian Ocean in a storm. Finally, I get to Trincomalee, and they're within the protective boundaries of the British Imperial Navy. They land at Trincomalee, they refuel, they check their engines over, and the next day, they head out for Karachi, India. 30 minutes out of Trincomalee, First Officer John Mack is scanning his instruments, looking out at the engines, and he looks out at number 3, does a double take. Oil is pouring out of the back of number 3 engine. He says, what the hell's going on? And at the same time, Swede Rothy at engineering says, number 3 is losing oil pressure, cutting number 3, feathering number 3. Ford says, uh-oh. Immediately, his pilot's instinct kicks in. He's only 30 minutes out of Trincomalee. He swings around, goes back, lands at Trincomalee, and when they get out to inspect it, the number 3 engine has blown a cylinder. Is this the end of the flight? No way. Remember I said that the 2 mechanics, Vern White from Auckland and Mo Hitchcock from EMEA and Bud Washer from EMEA, those 3 wonderful mechanics, in association with Swede Rothy, the engineer, go to work. Now, there's a story which was propagated by Pan American's own public relations department, published in the Pan American House Organ upon the occasion of their safe arrival back in New York, that at that time, the ingenuity of these engineers was such that they were able to commandeer help from a British warship in the harbor, to which they went to the machine shop, and machined a special tool necessary to ream out the broken studs of the cylinder so they could take it out and replace it. Not true. A little while after I got my book published, I received a letter from Vern White, who was still alive at that time. And he explained in detail what really happened. When he left Auckland, he took with him his favorite air drill. When they got to Trincomalee and ran into that problem, the only thing they required from the British was a length of air hose and a compressor. And with that and his air drill, they were able to take out the broken studs, replace the cylinder from the spare parts they had fortuitously loaded on at Auckland, and repair the engine. So to say that those mechanics, and especially Mo Hitchcock and Bud Washer, were responsible for the successful conclusion of this flight is to credit them with the fact that if it hadn't been for their repair of that engine, again, that flight would have died right there. Okay? So the engine is fixed. Now, here we come to a point in the flight where things get a little more routine. The flight from Trincomalee, the second time out, to Karachi and Bahrain and Khartoum is reasonably quiet. They're essentially within Allied territory here. They don't have to worry about the Japanese, the Germans are way up here, and the flight is essentially routine. As Captain Ford explained to me when he describes the entire flight, it was all routine, strictly routine by the book. So at Karachi, they had received word that Vern White was to deplane at Karachi and report for duty to a new air base being built there for the Allies, and he was to help establish the aircraft maintenance facility. Likewise, at Bahrain, Bud Washer and Mo Hitchcock were ordered off the aircraft to help establish the maintenance facility there. So without those mechanics, Ford and his crew proceeded to Khartoum, landing in the Nile River, essentially without incident. But upon takeoff from the Nile River in Khartoum to head for Leopoldville, the number 1 engine loses, now I'm not an engineer, so maybe I'm describing this incorrectly. On the exhaust stack of the engine, there was some kind of an extension, like a long pipe or something, to lift the exhaust flame away from the wing surface. This exhaust stack extension blows off, and the engine begins to hammer like an unmuffled car. And Ford says, can we fly it this way? And Swede says, it's a little fire hazard, but the instruments are good, let's go on. So they go on to Leopoldville. At Leopoldville, they land in the Congo, okay? And Ford notes as they land that the water in the Congo is flowing toward the sea at 6 knots. The prevailing surface wind is also blowing west to the west at 4 knots. The next day, and of course, by the time they by the time they get to Leopoldville, they're now within Pan Am facilities. Pan Am has the gas. No problem now with gas. But there is one major problem. The flight intended from Leopoldville to Natal will be 3,100 miles nonstop. The longest distance this B-314 has ever flown. To make that, they need all the gas they can carry. With Swede Rothy monitoring, they load 5,100 gallons of 100-octane fuel, and the aircraft is immediately 2,000 pounds over gross. The temperature at Leopoldville is over 100. The humidity damn near the same. Ford has to make a decision. Do we take off upriver against the wind to get the help of the 4 knots? Or do we take off downriver to get the help of the current, and never mind the 4 knots? He has to make that decision. He decides to take off downriver with the current. But there's a kicker and a joker in this. The station manager at Leopoldville informs him, if you take off downriver, you better go taxi far enough upriver so you're off the water before you reach the Congo gorges. The Congo River, a little ways west of Leopoldville, drops into a canyon, and the surface of the water drops off into rapids and rocks. He'd better be off before he reaches that precipice. He still decides to take off downstream. He taxis upstream, maybe a couple of miles, I don't know, until he decides he has enough room. And immediately as he turns around, he feels this current dragging him toward the precipice. Okay, Swede, let's not waste time. Full power. Let's go. And they begin the run. Now, this aircraft is roughly 2,000 pounds over gross in 100-degree temperature with a slight tailwind. And those pilots of you who have ever experienced it know what I'm talking about when I say the ugly head of density altitude came into play. Anybody know what density altitude is? Somebody here? A brief explanation. When it's hot and humid, and especially when it's high altitude, although they weren't that high, the ability of the air to support the airplane decreases because the air density reduces to a level equivalent to a very high altitude. So high density altitude means poor aircraft performance. And this 2,000-pound overloaded behemoth is racing downriver toward this precipice, and Ford is watching the airspeed. Now, a Boeing B-314 is supposed to be able to break the suction of the water and lift off just over 70 knots, while the landing stall speed is 80 knots. And he's watching for that criterion. And he's holding the yoke with his right hand, his left hand hard against the throttles, and trying to milk it up. But the Congo River, while flowing at 6 knots, is very smooth. And you know what happens to a flying boat in smooth water? The suction holds it down. 20 seconds pass, 30 seconds, 40. He's not off yet. Ford is cool but sweating. He says to himself, if I'm not off in another 20 seconds, I'll pull back 2, 3, and 4. Leave 1 at full power. Its torque will swing us around and go back and try again. Just as he's about to They make that decision. The airspeed hits 80 knots and O2 comes off the water. Now they're really in trouble. Hovering just above the surface, being supported not so much by the lift of the wing as the effect of ground effect, and you pilots know what ground effect is. The cushion of air under the wing of an airplane when it's very close to the ground, or in this case, to the water. And just at that moment, they pass the rim of the gorge, the water drops away, and they lose the ground effect. Swede Rothy from the engineering station doesn't know this yet. He calls out, 90 seconds, skipper, that's max time for a maximum power. Can we cut it back? Ford says, hell no, keep it to the stops, we're not out of this. So they keep the airplane to the stops, and it sinks into the gorge. Nose slightly high, but no lift, and it starts to drop. Ford looks at the airspeed, and now he has to make another decision. Here, all his instinct says, this airplane is going down, I better pull back and make it go up. But you know what happens when you pull back the wheel and you don't have the power? The airplane doesn't go up. All that happens is the angle of attack goes up and the stall speed increases. Ford knows this. Against all instinct, he moves the wheel forward, putting the nose down. Because now he has a little more ground clearance, even though the ground is rapids and rocks. And he builds up the airspeed. Slowly, the airspeed comes from 80 to 85 knots, a little over 85, and he thinks, aha, I have enough airspeed to play with this baby. He begins to milk it back to 80 knots, and all of a sudden, Johnny Mac calls out, rate of climb up 20 feet, 40 feet, 60, 100, I think we're gonna make it. Ford says, great, but look up ahead. They're still below the level of the gorge. The river is turning, and the gorge is turning. Ahead is a wall of rock. He has to turn. Okay, good and well. It looks like they have enough room to turn. He feeds in a little rudder, a little aileron. Uh-oh. The aileron won't move. It's stuck. It won't move. He can move it back and forth, but it won't turn. With no aileron and a little bit of rudder, the ship skids almost uncontrollably. Ford says, Swede, what the hell gives? I don't have no rudder control. The Swede says, hang on, I think I know what the trouble is. And here's where I refer to what you should remember about the view through the catwalk and the cables to the controls. He looks in through the catwalk, and with his practiced engineering eye, he sees that the overweight Boeing, combined with the high temperature, that great wing has flexed. Enough for him to notice, and enough for those cables to be jammed in their pulleys. He can't free them up. Swede calls to Ford. The pulleys are jammed. We can't free them up until we can get into cooler air and decrease the wing flexing. And Ford's, okay, this is going to be a sleigh ride. And he begins to skid the turns through the canyon as best he can. You know, when you skid, in the direction that the tail goes, the opposite wing goes down. Well, that causes the airplane to bank, even though you have no aileron control. But an airplane banking at marginal speed is very close to a stall. But Ford hangs on, and he goes back and forth, keeping in the center of that river. And gradually, ever so slowly, the rate of climb continues up. 200, 300. I don't know how far they got it, but hopefully they got to a standard rate of climb of 500 feet a minute. And eventually, the edge of the canyon disappears, and spread out before them is the grand scope of the Congo, and they're clear of the canyon. And Ford calls out, Swede, I think we're okay. You can cut back to cruise climb and set the mixtures for proper fuel consumption. Swede Rothy at the engineering station. Whew. He pulls it back, he sets the engines for climb, and I don't know if he said this or not, but in my imagination, knowing what I know about flight crews, and the responses to such situations. I wrote this dialogue for him. He's wiping the sweat off his brow, and he says aloud, "My God, I don't want to try that again anytime soon." Ford looks at his clock. The Wright Cyclone, 1,600 horsepower engines, designed by Wright for a maximum full power time of 90 seconds, have been held wide open for 3 minutes. He listens. They sound okay, except for that number one still yammering from its broken exhaust stack. And they proceed out to sea. Where are we? Out to sea, across the Atlantic to Natal. And that flight, it was a good thing. They loaded 5,100 gallons of fuel. By the time they land in Natal, they had been in the air from Leopoldville to Natal 23 hours and 35 minutes. They landed with 2 hours of reserve fuel. Okay? Now, it's like a piece of cake. They're back in home waters. Natal is a Pan Am base. Port of Spain is a Pan Am base, and of course, New York. At Natal, they attempt a repair of the stack, but it doesn't work. So they decide to go on to Port of Spain. At Port of Spain, the mechanics there have enough supplies to repair the exhaust stack properly, and they go on to the last leg of the flight to New York. On the morning, I think it was January 6th, might have been 5th, I have to check that out again. It's black, it's pitch black at 6 o'clock. It's almost 6 o'clock in the morning. It's winter time. The air traffic controller in LaGuardia Tower, in those days there was not much traffic. If you were on the midnight shift and an air traffic controller, it was pretty dull. You'd almost doze off. All of a sudden, his loudspeaker comes alive. It's Captain Ford. Now, the company says he said Pacific Clipper inbound from New Zealand, request landing instructions. The controller says, what? Okay. So, he can't land until daylight. The controller asks him if he can hold. He says, sure, we got enough fuel. So they hold. Now, in connection with that haul in Pacific Clipper, that was what was reported by Pan Am in their public relations flight article. As a minor backtrack, when I first interviewed Ford, he said he never knew the names of the Clippers because even in those days, the official way to identify yourself in a commercial airliner was either by the trip number or the tail number. Pacific Clipper didn't really mean too much because the public relations department constantly changed the names of the Clippers. You wouldn't know which one you were in. And Ford said, I never knew him. I just used the tail number. So it's more than likely that he said, LaGuardia Tower, Clipper 18602. Whatever. They land in Bowery Bay, and you think they're home safe. They relax. Ford notes rather curiously, as they taxi in, the water splashing over the sea wings is freezing into ice. And he thinks, mighty cold out there. Hadn't thought about that. We've been flying along the equator most of the way. I hope they have some warm clothes for us. And as he's musing these things over, all of a sudden, the big ship lurches. There's a big bang, and it comes to a sudden stop. Ford says, what the hell is happening? Johnny Mack looks out the window and very nonchalantly says, Skipper, I think we've run aground on a sandbar. Now, there's an interesting aside to this event. John Steers reports in one of his journals that at that moment, he was standing on the flight deck behind Ford's seat. And when they hit that bar, he says, in effect, the back of Bob Ford's neck turned beet red. He was angry. And in his anger, he shoves the throttles to full power. The 6,400 horsepower drag it off the sandbar, and it's now floating again. They get to the dock. They tie up. They're met by a reception committee of Pan Am officials, U.S. Customs, Navy and Army intelligence, and of course, as usual, bureaucratic debriefing. Ultimately, Ford and some of his other crew members returned to the Pacific Division. John Steers reports that he and some of his crew members were immediately transferred to the Atlantic Division. And there's some naysayers who would say that they never did really go around the world because they didn't finish up from New York back to San Francisco. Technicalities. Okay, but as far as the ship was concerned, yes, it did. Because later on, Pan Am assigned a ferry crew to take it back to San Francisco. So in effect, the airplane itself did make the circumnavigation, okay? So that was the end of the story. And as Lewis Carroll wrote in Alice in Wonderland, the best way to tell a story is to begin at the beginning, go on until you come to the end, and then stop. So at this point, I'm stopping, and I'm open to questions.